Everyone. My name is Laura Mullen, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, The Library in 2020, featuring Joe Janes of the University of Washington and sponsored by Rowman and Littlefield. Today's webinar is the first in a new series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that will address new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations will provide a new opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. What's new and distinctive about this series is the audience. This is the first series of this type directed toward the nearly 12,000 ACRL members and 15,000 Choice users and fans that collectively comprise perhaps the single largest and most important audience in academic librarianship today. Important issues and products deserve lively, candid, and informed discussion, and this is something we believe this new program and this audience will deliver in spades. It's a program that offers something for everyone. For librarians, it offers an opportunity to learn about and discuss new ideas, issues, and products. For sponsors, it offers an opportunity to receive unfiltered and direct feedback from the most knowledgeable audience in the academic library community. And for the academic library community writ large, it offers one more forum for addressing common solutions to common problems and taking advantage of common opportunities. Here at Choice, we are very excited to be working with our ACRL colleagues to bring thought-provoking, high-quality content to the world of academic libraries and look forward to today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will see a Q&A panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We have some time today reserved at the end of the program to respond to your questions, so please feel free to submit these throughout the program. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archive version. And here to introduce our featured speaker, Joe Janes, is Charles Harmon, Executive Editor at Rowman & Littlefield, the publishers of Library 2020. Many of you will know Charles from his former role as Vice President of Neil Schuman Publishers, where he helped spearhead and shape Neil Schuman's outstanding library science publishing program. Today, as the publisher of seminal works like Library 2020, he continues to shape and influence the world of academic librarianship. Charles?
Thank you, Laura. I'm very happy to be able to have the honor to introduce Joe Janes. Joe has written several books, and one of the most important things about writing a book is both to have something to say and to say it well. Joe not only does those two things, but he says what he says in a very non-boring and very exciting way. Joe is a professor at the University of Washington Information School. He has written several books on library and information services and received the Isadora Gilbert Mudge Award from the American Library Association for distinguished contributions to reference librarianship. The presentation today is outgrowth of a book he is just finishing now. He's proofing the pages today called Library 2020. And Library 2020 will present his vision and the vision of others for what the library will be and will not be in the year 2020. And without further ado, over to you, Joe.
Well, thanks, Charles. And I want to thank everybody at ACRL and Choice and of course, the folks at Rowman and Littlefield and the people making this all possible, all the technical stuff and everything. It's a lovely day here in Seattle. I'm sitting here in my office and the opportunity to talk to several hundred of my friends and colleagues. I see some familiar names in the attendee list is a great opportunity. I really appreciate it. You may also hear I'm at the very, very tail end of a cold, so I'll try really hard not to sound more disgusting than usual, and so everybody just sort of bear with me. And again, I'd like to encourage people as we go, if you have questions, type them in the little Q&A box, and I've left some time at the end. I'm actually running my timer here now to be able to respond to those questions. When Charles suggested this book to me, so it's all his idea, I thought, well, you know, there's a lot of this, what's the future of libraries, the prediction business going on. And one of the first things I thought of was, you know, the nature of prediction and how the nature of prediction sort of can occasionally catch you. This slide may be familiar to some of you from one of my favorite movies, but probably one of the worst movies ever made, Plan 9 from Outer Space. And it begins with this scene, and Criswell, who was a psychic of the day back in the 50s, said, "We are all interested in the future, ladies and gentlemen, because that is where you and I will spend the rest of our lives," which the childhood me thought was kind of impressive until I saw the rest of the movie. The prediction thing, you know, if you're right, everybody says it was really obvious, and if you're wrong, you look like a boob. So rather than try to predict things myself, I thought I'd let some friends and colleagues and smart people who know a lot of things take a crack at it. And that's the genesis of this book, is the idea of getting a lot of different voices and from many different perspectives and around many different areas of the library world, and give them the floor. I've got the end of the book and I've got a little bit of end here, but mainly I want to highlight some of the things, the kind of the range of opinions and the range of ideas that came from this. And the way I wanted to do it was to give it something just a little bit distinctive, something a little bit different, is I asked people to begin their essays with filling in the blank on that sentence. And I gave them very little instruction other than this. I said, you can talk about this from the perspective of your library, from libraries in general, from a kind of library, from any perspective you like, and you can say anything you like. I gave them no particular instructions other than to say, be bold, be inspiring, be controversial, be depressing, be whatever you want, just don't be boring. And everybody, I am glad to say, achieved that. And as they began to come in, then I faced the challenge that I hadn't thought about first of how you categorize these, because I didn't tell people write about this, write about that. I said write about anything. So now I've got all these fantastic essays. How to categorize them? Well, somebody, product of a couple of different ideas, led me to the categorization structure that I use for this. Somebody a few years ago asked me, what is the library going to look like in 100 years? And I was a little stumped by that, but then I thought, well, you know, what does a library look like now, and how is it compared to what a library looks like 100 years ago? I got this image. I was just in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, and so here's the Broadhead, Wisconsin Public Library 100 years ago, 1912. And I always find pictures like this of very old library pictures simultaneously reassuring and a little unsettling. That doesn't look very different from what many small libraries look like these days if you stuck some computers in there and maybe some DVDs and CDs and so on. So there's an aspect of this that is very reassuring, and yet wouldn't we think somehow that more would have changed over the last 100 years? But in thinking about what the library is going to be like in 100 years, let's think about the things that have endured so long that they're kind of persistent and we don't even think about them. So what endures about libraries? Well, this categorization seems to me not only to cover what the essential features of a library, but the essential features of a library that have been around for a very long time. And that says to me that these are the kind of features that will go on. Much of this also emerged in the work that I did many years ago with a group of fantastic students in building the Internet Public Library project. When you build a library that exists only in only in virtual space, only on the internet, you quickly begin to think about what makes something actually a library. And these were among the things that emerged from that discussion, and also the kinds of things that I think help to distinguish libraries from other kinds of institutions, and also tell us the kinds of things that will endure. So that was the very broad categorization I used for the essays that people wrote for me. The places where I put them is entirely arbitrary. Many of these essays could easily fit in more than one place, and I hope people don't mind where I put them, and I hope the neighbors are quiet and don't play the music too loud. But I also think they make interesting juxtapositions and interesting combinations between all the essays. And what I want to do now is to share with you just a smattering of the ideas that emerged from these, interspersed with a few ideas of my own, and then I'll sort of wrap up at the end. So let me start with stuff, and in particular, that's where I am right now. Now, I'm not actually there right now because that picture was taken a few days ago, but that's where I am right now. That's my office. And in fact, I've got a different presentation on the screen there. That's the presentation I did a couple weeks ago about my podcast project on documents that change the world, which you can also see on YouTube and on iTunes. So I know about stuff I know about. And so that's to establish my credibility around the idea of stuff. So among the people that I asked to write an essay is the annoyed librarian. And no, I don't know who it is. We communicated by email. I have no earthly idea. But I was grateful to the annoyed librarian, I believe it's a she, for contributing. And what you see there in the sort of red print is how she finished the sentence. So you're going to see this for each of the participants. The library in 2020 will be just like the library today, except without all the books, music, and movies. And what this essay did is work through many issues that we're all thinking about a lot. That there are lots of formats that are continuing to shift around books, around music, around movies. I would also add the scholarly literature and a variety of other kinds of formats. And those formats are shifting from physical formats that we were all familiar with through digital, and then into streaming, and then into the cloud. And that progression provides a series of opportunities and challenges to those of us working and running in libraries. There are also a whole variety of services and functions and roles that go on around those, and those are also shifting. And of course, partially those shift because of the shift in formats, and partially they also shift as a result of changes in our communities and so on. And the question that this essay really raises is what stays and what goes and why and how. And I thought she did a beautiful job, and actually I chose this essay to start the book. Elizabeth Jones, I have to show off, she's my doctoral student, has been working a lot on large-scale digitization, studying large-scale digitization projects. And she wrote a fascinating piece about how the scanning of tens of millions of books by Google and the Open Content Alliance, and then the after products such as HathiTrust and so on, how that will transform the way we think about libraries and the way libraries do what they do. Certainly this raises questions of preservation and rights management, especially that weird nether region from the middle 20s to the early 90s, give or take, with all the orphan work issues. But also she raises up a set of opportunities around exposure and use. As more and more people find and are aware of these works, more and more people are going to want to use them, and that may well involve engaging with libraries and even print collections, raises questions of size and space, certainly raises questions of disintermediation and service. One might ask the folks, for example, at the DPLA, if they're going to build a library, where the service component is to that. I might insert, Elizabeth didn't talk about it, but I might insert the same question about disintermediation and service to the MOOC world. All this business about MOOCs, and we're doing classes, and we're teaching higher education online, et cetera. Where's the library in that? Where's the service component in that? Because that has not been part of the conversation. Cliff Lynch wrote a fascinating piece, as you can imagine, And his answer is it's a mirror of the broader society's questions and discontents about the evolution of the marketplace for cultural materials. Um, Several people talked in the book, Cliff among them, about the process of creation, the culture of creation. And of course, there's been a lot of energy and excitement in the public library community about that, around maker spaces and so on. But one could also include lots of the things that go on in research libraries and academic libraries, and of course the engagement with faculty and scholars of all kinds. Cliff here is talking about those means of creation and production and distribution, including local production, and raises the issue of things that will only be available in downloadable formats but will not be available for a variety of reasons, and also traces a larger question about the migration from sale of these kinds of works to license. The recent stuff around the first sale doctrine and being able to resell digital objects and so on. I mean, we all know that's going to have an effect. We don't know what it is yet, but we have to figure out what a digital work is and how it's different and the same from the way we have thought about physical works. So a lot of this is up in the air, and this is things that are very familiar. There's been a lot of chat about a lot of this kind of stuff. The question I ask is, can libraries still viably think of themselves primarily as being about access to stuff? This will come up again in a little while, but if that's the case, what, how, and when? We are no longer, by and large, in an access-limited world. Yes, copyright, yes, paywalls, yes, licensing, yes, 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 yes. And especially many of the works that academic and research libraries in particular represent, yes. But over the long haul, it is not going to be an access problem, primarily. So if we think of ourselves as an access mechanism primarily, that may not be a winning strategy going forward. So what happens to the mission and rationale for libraries, both internally and the way an external community views us, as these ideas around formats and stuff and access to that stuff continue to evolve? I think those are questions we all are going to have to confront and come up with answers to fairly quickly. Let me talk about place. I can't quite see it from my office, but just across the way, this is the main reading room at the University of Washington in the Suzzallo Library. This is one vision people have of academic libraries, the sort of grand palace sort of thing. This is another. This is the Research Commons in the Allen Library right next door. So there are often these sort of dual visions of libraries, both grand and kind of intimate. And several people talked about the sense of place, including Bill Potasic, who's the director of the King County Library System here in the area, who I thought phrased it beautifully, that in the library in 2020 will be a concept more than a place. And I love this phrase. It's more about what it does for people than what it has for people. Of course, he's speaking from a public library perspective, but there's a lot in there, I think, for all of us to think about. And the notion that people came to a place to get service, if the place is now somehow differently conceived or differently organized or differently managed or run, then the way you think about service can shift in that space as well. The gathering space, the learning space, the space for civic engagement, all of those things are certainly in play. The notion of outreach, which manifests differently in different kinds of libraries, as we know, but what outreach really means. King County in particular has been exploring this with their staff over the last few years, and freeing up librarians to go out and engage with the community in ways that we might not have been doing in other times and places. So the idea of what it means to be not completely located sort of isometrically with the stuff, and how that changes the way you think about service and the place and what goes on in the place is a fascinating set of questions. It's hard to pick a favorite out of these. If I had to pick one that I thought was the most beautifully composed, it might be Lorraine's. Lorraine Roy, who's the former president of ALA and a professor down at the iSchool of Texas. The piece she wrote is lyrical. It's got just an incredible succession of these gorgeous images and words. She talks about the glamour and intrigue of libraries, that libraries can be comfortable. I love this expression, a place of potential, a place to question yourself and question others. She writes this in the first person, so it's very much, I want a place where I will be able to lead a fulfilled life, a place which many of us are always seeking, a place where we're known and remembered and forgiven and welcomed. Isn't that a beautiful idea? And of course, she mentions the sauna and the fact that there will always be wild rice salad, which I can't disagree with either of those, to be honest with you. That's just a lovely, lovely piece, and I was just so happy that Lorene agreed to be part of this. The place of place. This was, again, something that emerged from the IPL work over the years, is people found place, a sense of place, to be very important on the internet. Now, mind you, this is the middle 90s, but I think it's still very much the case. The idea of place in an inherently placeless place is a very powerful notion. And we are going to be engaging now in the question of how important that sense of place really is, both physical and virtual, and the interplay between the two, and the relationships between the two, and what we can do better in one than the other, and what we can do better in both than neither. The use of space and what it's for and what it can do, which a lot of academic libraries are coping with. And then I had the opportunity just last week to go up to Vancouver, British Columbia. I was hosted by some fascinating folks from the community and technical college community up in British Columbia. The folks in Douglas College invited me to come up. And we heard a presentation from a woman at Camosun College, which is a small two-year college in Victoria, I think. And all of the things that they had done around building a research commons, and how, the questions about who manages it, and how do you schedule housekeeping, and who's in control of what, and how much do you expose, and all these kinds of issues that when you begin to break down walls and open up spaces and repurpose space and place, you get a very different vision of the space. I'm a fan of the Research Commons idea. I'm actually going over to our Research Commons this afternoon to spend a couple hours with my students doing a research project with me this quarter. I do my office hours for my doctoral students over there when I teach statistics. I go over there all the time because it's a great space and there's a lot of energy and I love to use it. One question I keep asking myself is, why is that space in a library? You walk in that space, and it's the entire first floor of the Allen South Library, what used to be the old science library. And there's nothing about that space that says library. There's a service desk, there's a bunch of flexible furniture and so on, the usual things, but there's nothing that says library. And that space could easily be in a classroom building, it could be in a dormitory, it could be almost anywhere. And I love the idea that libraries are innovating these. I love the idea that there's lots of different models for these. Seattle University has built a beautiful learning commons down in their space in a renovation a few years ago. But trying to figure out how that authentically is a library space and how we instrument for that, how we staff that, how we serve that, I think that's the piece we don't yet have worked out yet. And I would very much like to see lots of additional models how we get there. People. Well, when I die, this is the library I want to work in. I hope you recognize this as the only romantic comedy ever written about library automation. This is Desk Set, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, 1957. Dina Merrill in the foreground is not looking very happy despite the fact that she's holding a glass of champagne. And Joan Blondell's looking considerably happier next to the Christmas tree. This is a great role model for us all. I mean, any library images that involve champagne and silver lame can't be all bad. The whole point of this is that they bring in a computer and it's supposed to replace them, but they win in the end. They do win in the end, but more challenges lie ahead. And if only they knew in 56 years on how things would be going. Sarah Houghton, who writes the Librarian in Black blog, also the director at San Rafael down in California, wrote a great piece about technology and said the library in 2020 will be ruled by geeks. Makes a very strong statement about the role of technology in the profession and as a professional function and mission. And not only because it's an increasingly technological world and so much more of our work involves technology these days, which is absolutely true, but she also says, and I love this, that skills that make good techies make good leaders. And I'd never heard anybody say that quite that way before, that if you're a good technical person, if you have good technical skills, that gives you flexibility, that gives you the ability to deal with change, that gives you the ability to deal with problem solving. I agree with all of that. I never put two and two together, but, and then she raises the really interesting notion of an increasingly hybrid thing, not necessarily, she doesn't say necessarily, just hiring technical people to work alongside MLIS folks, but increasing hybrids, and as an educator I find this interesting, increasing hybrids of people with MLIS backgrounds and technology backgrounds. Let me pause here for just a second. There's a really interesting stream of questions coming in, so by all means, feel free as we go. I know I'm touching on all of these things really lightly. If there's things that you're interested in, if there's something that piques your interest, by all means, slap it into the Q&A thing, and we'll have a chance to talk about those things in a few minutes. Stephen Abram, an old friend who's been in the information industry for a long time, just simply says the library will be everywhere. And he goes into considerable detail talking about service. And, when I say people, I mean staff people, excuse me, and in particular the kind of service functions. Now, that's not strictly reference service or, reader's advisory or research consultation or whatever. That's service in a lot of ways. I would incorporate in there creation of metadata. I would incorporate in there the creation of programming and the design of spaces and services and so on. But he talks primarily about things like professional assistance in areas that we all kind of do, but you don't always necessarily think of together. Consultation, training, evaluation, advice, I would add guidance, and so on. He also emphasizes the importance of expertise in copyright and licensing, privacy, ethics, use of information. And those are pieces that I see an increasing interest in the wider world around copyright and licensing and ethics and so on, and especially things like privacy. And as more and more things happen around privacy, you get more and more concerned about that. And why not us? Why not libraries is the kind of place to go for lots of those kinds of things. He also talks about the importance of embedding in organizational teams of all kinds and all different kinds of sectors, which another important message I would completely agree with. Oh my gosh. James Rosenzweig, who's now at Northeastern Illinois University, wrote one of the more penetrating, I guess is the way to put this. He takes the metaphor of a base camp, which I know next to nothing about because I'm not the woodsy type, but people who are wanting to do sort of hiking, rock climbing, mountaineering, that sort of stuff. The idea of a base camp, which is not, the Eddie Bauer that you go and buy the gear, but it's not the training thing back home, but it's as you're out on the trail, this is where people stop to get help, to get advice, to maybe rest up for a little while. And he makes this metaphor, I think, very powerfully effective, that it's we have created an information landscape and environment that's very controlled. We have built the collections, we have built the spaces, we have designed the services, we have designed the metadata, excuse me, we've designed the systems, we've got the, we set the terms. And so we get really comfortable in that space because we know all that stuff because we built it. But you go beyond that door, either physically or virtually, and it's a much wilder, as he says, less predictable landscape and environment. And that's where people need help even more, is out in the big wide world. And we bring to that experience, preparation, and knowledge of the terrain, because all of the information skills that we know about pertain not only to our own controlled and professionally curated and created spaces, it also works, we know how to make the rest of it work too. And I love this phrase. Our job is not to convince people not to use the world of information we did not control or maintain, because they're not going to not use that world. And they're going to be way better off in that world with our help. And so what they need to do is to be able to touch in with us, to be able to get a little guidance here and there, to be able to get some advice, some ideas, perhaps to share ideas with each other in a kind of community setting. And that's a powerful idea. And I'm very grateful to James for contributing that. A lot of this reduces to the question, who shall we be? What's the right mix of skills and backgrounds? As I said, as an educator, people ask me this all the time, what are you teaching in library school these days? Well, that's a really good question because there's lots of ways we can go. What's the role of technology? How much database? How much XML? How much coding? How much web design? How much, content management system? How much? And then how much of the soft skills, how much of the interviewing, how much of the community analysis, how much of the social work, how much of all of that. For people who are going to be builders, for people who are going to be designers, for people who are going to be users, for people who are going to be guides, a great, great word. Several people in these chapters talk about a number of professional role models, Katharine Hepburn and otherwise. And then Courtney Green, who I've had a chance to work with a couple of times and who I very much admire, had this great little phrase that I had to include. How much of librarianship is what we do and how much is how we do it? Oh, love that, love that, love that. Community, if you want to find some really dreadful clip art, just Google the word community and see what comes up. I went for the and I know this audience is largely academic and research libraries, so let me just give you a few phrases here. Mike Crandall from here at the iSchool talked about providing critical services and things that are unduplicated elsewhere. He's been part of the USA Impact Study for many years and has been looking at the role of public access technology and the role of libraries in facilitating a lot of other kind of work. Molly Raphael, another former president of ALA, who talks about the process of authentic engagement and, of course, her particular interests and concerns around partnerships and advocacy. Lynn Filipini-Conaway, who's been doing research for many years on virtual reference and so on, has this lovely idea of boutique and tailored services in relationships to particular communities and audiences, and also embedding those in places that you might not expect, including places like airports and parks, which is a really provocative idea. And Susan Hildreth, the head of IMLS, who wrote a very nice piece about civic institutions, the role of civic institutions, and the library is one of those, and particular features of the library that we don't always think about. The library is a trusted institution. The library is a neutral institution, and the fact that by and large people love us. And that's a tremendous asset. Again, she writes largely here from the public library perspective, but I think a lot of that translates into other environments as well. Excuse me. And then leadership and vision. That's a picture of the emerging leaders. That's the people who are going to be in charge in the not very distant future. A couple of them are in charge now. I see a couple of familiar faces in there. There's another familiar face, Josie Barnes-Parker. God, I love Josie. Director of the Ann Arbor District Library. Look at that phrase in red. There's a lot going on in that phrase. That libraries will offer a culture of generosity supported by fiscal oversight that reflects rigorous controls and realistic projections. Now that's the kind of person, that is a professional role model. There's a lot going on in that phrase. She also tells this wonderful story, the punchline of which is never forget how power is manifested. I try to explain that to my students all the time, but I think until you've been on the wrong side of that, it's hard to quite fully appreciate how that goes. That's just a beautiful little piece. And the idea of know what your boundaries are, know where you're going, but then be able to be generous and realistic about it is a great idea. Another person I'm a real fan, Marianne Mavernack, who's now at University of Rochester. I got to know her when she was in Toronto. Told a great tale of two cities story. One academic library flourishing in the best of times, one languishing in the worst of times. And the importance of transformational change, which involves risk-taking and trust and sharing. And again, I think this great little phrase, thinking honestly about freeing and reallocating resources toward a sustainable future. We can't do everything, so how do we reallocate resources in such a way that we can actually get somewhere? Peter Morville, some of you might have had a little foretaste. Peter put his essay up on his website a few months ago as a little foretaste. Took a little crap for it because people didn't realize he was trying to be a little satirical. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, satire is what closes on Saturdays. But he writes this fantastic article. He called it Inspiration Architecture and says that the library in 2020 will be the last bastion of truth. I certainly hope not, but I can think of worse things. And the idea of a library as architecture for inspiration, to enable our search for the truth, for what we've done and where we're going, and the interplay between the physical and the digital. It's a very provocative piece, and I hope it gives you, just those of you who read it at the time or track it down now, I hope that gives you a tiny bit of a glimpse of the kinds of things that are in the book. And then Dan Chudnoff, who I also have a lot of respect for, who calls himself a hacker/librarian and is now Director of Scholarly Technology at George Washington, says that the library will be crumbling. And there's a lot in that vision that is not happy or pleasant. But he ends with this kind of rallying cry about it's our job to fight for rights of our communities, to make choices about how they seek, manage, maintain, and share information. And I actually ended the book with Dan because it is a rallying cry. It is almost a plea for people to think really hard about where libraries fit and what they do and how they move forward in an increasingly fraught environment. So you have a little bit of sense here of what I saw in all of these essays. Images of hope, of peril, of success, of failure, both productive and otherwise, and I'm a huge fan of productive failure. Images of innovation and possibility and warning, and progress. So let me give myself another couple minutes here to just tell you what I think, both as a product of reading and working with all of these pieces, but also for my own purposes. I do believe that those 5 elements will endure. But the more I think about this, the more I think what we do cannot be primarily about access. We have provided ourselves, we have thought of ourselves and designed our services and designed our institutions around the idea of access. And there are still challenges to access and barriers to access, and I stipulate all of that. But you don't have to look very far around the wider information world to get the sense that access is no longer going to be the primary challenge. So if we continue to present ourselves as an access mechanism, as a middleman, that is not a winning strategy going forward. It is not a good time for middlemen. Ask the people who own record stores. Ask the travel agents. Ask the newsstands. Ask the booksellers. It is not a good time to be a middleman. And so we've got to figure out ways of being something other than a middleman, or in addition to being a middleman, that will continue to articulate the vitality and importance of what we do that we all really understand. What is going to happen will emerge from what we have been, what people want, and what people are willing to pay for. And I would include in this in the context of values that are really important to all of us. There's a lot of values that we are very familiar with. stewardship and custodianship and intellectual freedom and equality of access and the protection of intellectual property and privacy. All true. I'd add some other values in here like cooperation and technological sophistication, and a tolerance for risk and a willingness to fail. And if I got to pick, I would also take a few values out of our professional mix like pig-headedness and intransigence and a fear of failure and a fear of risk, because I think those things hold us back in a lot of ways. I also think that what we do has got to emerge and will from things that we uniquely bring to the table. An orientation around service, the notion of organization and metadata. The linked data community has come to us for a reason, because we're really good at this, and because we produce really high quality metadata and organizational stuff, and people recognize the importance of that. We bring a focus on literacy in all of its various forms, and I think that word has tremendous power, because literacy, what literacy really means is, or what it signifies is, an access to the culture. If you are not literate in all different kinds of forms and aspects of information, you are not able to fully participate in the culture. And of course, we bring quality and depth and authority and detail, aspects that not everybody kind of gets. I also increasingly ponder how much of what we do can and should be thought of in the context of niches, that there are areas and aspects where quality and depth and authority and detail are really going to matter to people, where organization and metadata are really going to matter, where literacy is really going to matter, where the things that we do better than anybody else is really going to matter. And those are areas where we fit beautifully. We have often presented ourselves as a take-all-comers, we do everything for everybody kind of profession and institution. That's absolutely fine, and I kind of like that idea. But it doesn't mean that we can't more closely target services, collections, institutions, spaces, ways of interacting with our community in ways that specifically focus on what the community is and what it wants. And perhaps that means, as Marianne Mavernack would say, reallocating resources from one area to another that we actually would be better at. The final thing I would say is what I say to all of my students and to people who apply to our program and people who are graduating from our program. I say this all the time. We are the most important profession in the world, because every other activity is better with us. Every other thing that people do, architecture, medicine, law, science, faith, everything that everybody does is better off with us than without us. So figuring out ways of propelling that into the next decade and the next century, to be able to continue to fill those roles and do and undertake those services, I think is the real challenge for this generation of librarianship and this generation of libraries. So I began with the question, the library in 2020 will be. And I asked that in a very broad way to my contributors. But I think the really important question is this, not what the library will be in 2020. It's what your library will be in 2020. Which of the myriad possible futures do you want? And then how are you going to get there? How are you going to reorient, redesign, reallocate, rethink, refocus, re-whatever to get to the library you want to be, ought to be, have to be, can be, should be, to be able to further your interests and missions? I'll quote one more person, not in the book, unfortunately, but one more person, Betsy Wilson, who's the Dean of Libraries here, who once said to a class of mine, vision is a rudder for change. That if you know where you're going and why you're trying to get there, then the waters can shift, but you can steer a straighter course to get there. So I made up this hashtag, My Library in 2020. If you've got ideas, if you've got a vision, your library in 2020 will be something, try that out. Tweet it out, see what people say, and see what kind of response we get. And maybe we'll start a little thing with this and start a conversation online around this. Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to have been able to do this. And now I'm going to take some questions from the list that is getting sent to me over here. So now I get to read the questions. First one that's listed here is what effect this library in 2020 will have on staffing and professional training. I think that's a really good question. I raised that in the more formal part of the talk. And I think there's two aspects to that. There's the staffing and the training. We may need different kind of people. We may need people who come to us from different backgrounds. We may need a more technologically sophisticated workforce. We may need a more politically sophisticated workforce. We may need a more economically sophisticated workforce, because I think it's likely to be the case for all of us that every interaction has got to be, what does this do for me? How does this add value to the institution? I'm sure lots of provosts and lots of presidents and lots of deans and lots of so on are saying, what's it for? Why do we need you? What are you for? So being able to be, more articulate in that kind of realm in the language that they speak, that I think is actually quite important. But in terms of the training to do that, this again gets back to the notion of what is the library going to be. If we are more focused on things like service than access, if we are more focused on helping people to use resources than in collecting them, then that's a different, does that now give us more of the soft skills in a technologically sophisticated world, which means now we need more of the technological skills as well. I think that, and of course that's going to manifest differently, as so many other things do, in different kinds of institutional contexts. But that's the sort of thing that I will say on behalf of the educators. Hearing from my professional colleagues and friends here in the region, but also more broadly, about what you're looking for is tremendously helpful to us. I know sometimes that conversation doesn't always go so well, but I have lots of examples of people who say, I love your graduates, and, if only they were a little bit sharper on this, if only you could do a little bit more on that, if only, we'd love to have a little bit more of this. Done in a kind of positive, supportive way, I think that's really important. So I would encourage people to engage in that. Couple questions about access and the role of access. So somebody is asking, how do libraries provide access to materials if it's owned or controlled by somebody who charges for it? Well, I mean, that's kind of what we've done. What will libraries be primarily about? If not about access, if we don't provide access, who will? So I don't want to be misunderstood about the access thing. Certainly today and for the very near term, and probably beyond that, libraries are an access mechanism. And the points made about if we don't do it, who will? Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Who else? I mean, there's no other way to get access to the kinds of stuff in a scholarly database. Unless you go to Google Scholar and pay $39.99 for it, and not a lot of people are going to do that. It's also the case that people think of us as the place to go for access to resources, and that, to me, is a strength. In the public library context, I think that's particularly the case around books, and so books is going to be a really important aspect of that conversation going forward, whatever books wind up being, whatever the format and structure and physical form or lack thereof of the book winds up being. In the scholarly world, many people, especially humanists in the artistic community and some social scientists, do still think of the monograph in whatever format that is. The scientific community and some of the social scientific community, obviously the journal literature, and increasingly across the academy, people think of the data repository. Now, whether they quite have inserted the library into that equation or not as an access mechanism or a storage or curation or maintenance mechanism around repositories of research data, I think the jury is still out on that one. But that's an opening for us to be able to help them to think about us as something additional to access around metadata creation, around service, around collaboration, around around research consultations, around a number of different functions that that we can provide that are above and beyond the kind of, the traditional model of you go to the library and you take a book off the shelf, or you go to the library website and you download a copy of a research article. Excuse me, in the very long run, increasing amounts of material is going to be digitally accessible either only or primarily. Ebooks, open access journals, data repositories that live on the web, natively web stuff, YouTube, iTunes, all of this kind of stuff. We all know that. So the things that are not controlled by large megalithic companies who are out to kill us, that kind of stuff, we are not going to be part of the access equation because we don't hold it. We don't maintain it. We don't catalog it. We don't collect it. It just kind of happens. So the fraction of the human record that is represented by the traditional media that we all think of, books, journals, magazines, that kind of stuff, is shrinking. And it's really valuable stuff, and we do that better than anybody else, and we have to continue to do that. But we also have to think about, use James Rosenzweig's metaphor. How are we the guide to the base camp to people who are out there in the wild who need way more help than people in libraries do? How do we reorient our services and reorient our staff and reorient our communities to think of us in those ways? That's a great metaphor, and I think one well worth pursuing because it's such a powerful idea. Somebody else asked about an example of a niche. Well, what about the college student writing a term paper? That's a big niche, but it's a niche. The project information literacy research from the last few years and the other kind of research that we've had out of places like Illinois and Rochester that tells us a lot about the mind of a researcher, mind of a student doing research. They did it at the last minute. They're trying to use Wikipedia. They know better than to use Wikipedia, or they think they know better than not to be thinking about using Wikipedia. But they do it all in 48 hours. Well, how do we provide services to that audience in that place? So what do you plunk in the middle of a research commons? Sorry, that sounded terrible. What kind of service do you deploy in the middle of a research commons where those students already are to support them in writing a term paper in 48 hours? Because we know they're going to do it, and we can either blame them for it or we can help them. Maybe a workshop about how to use Wikipedia to harvest vocabulary to search a database. Maybe a topic brainstorm session with a group of students. Maybe a drop-in space for banging ideas around about how to focus your ideas for a term paper. That's that's not a take-all-comers kind of thing. You take everybody, but it's a much more targeted thing, and has the potential to kind of transform the way people think about using libraries to do research. And then you send them upstairs to the stacks, or you stick them on a computer and have them search ProQuest or whatever. I think that's a notion of niche that actually has a lot of stuff going on and a lot of potential for real benefit, not only to them but also to us, because then you get a better idea of what they're doing. Now should I get another degree, maybe in computer science or software engineering? Maybe. I agree with the point that Sarah Houghton makes about technology. I think you could overdo that, but it's just the more I see, the more, and I think she makes a persuasive case that having that background, having that facility, having that in your fingertips. I'll tell you, when I was a programmer 25 years ago, I knew a lot more about the way technology works than I do today because I haven't had to program in a very long time. I haven't built a database in a very long time, and I feel a little bit creaky about it. And so being up to date on that and being ready for that, I don't think it necessarily has to be a software engineering degree, although that's a great idea. And we've had some software engineers come through our program, and boy, they come out fantastic on the other end. Oh my goodness. I get two more questions. I get my little thing says I have two more questions. One of which is 7 years enough to show a major change in libraries? By God, I hope so, because the clock is ticking. It isn't a very long time. That's part of the reason that we picked, just 7 years out. It was 8 years when we started. Part of the reason we just picked 7 years out was that it was long enough to be interesting, but not so long as to be science fiction. But oh boy, think about where we were in 2006. And a lot of stuff has changed, and I think even more has to. I know it's scary. I know it's disturbing. I know there's a lot of risk. I know there's a lot of potential. But oh my gosh, there's so much to be done, and tremendous people to do it. I will tell you, reading these, even the ones that were a little bit dystopian, it's very energizing to read this stuff because you get so many interesting ideas and so many different perspectives and so many different visions of this that I think maybe 7 years is almost too much. Maureen McCory, thank you, Maureen McCory, wherever you are. Summation just got posted to me. We won't be just about access, and we should only be partly about access as long as actually needed. Oh, I like that. Thank you, Maureen. I'm your best friend. Last question here. What is the role of information or digital literacy competency in the future? Well, I think that ties back to the base camp idea. Not to harp on that too much, but the idea that we take people as they are and where they are. If they're in the building, if they're on the website, if they're engaged with us, great. If they're out in the wider world, fantastic, wonderful. But giving them the tools to be able to take the next step. One of the things I tell my reference students is sometimes the best solution to a reference question is to move them forward, especially in an environment like chat or texting or something where you can't expect miracles. Move them forward. Give them an idea. Give them a search term. Give them a source. Give them something to stand on and then say, I'm here to help the next time you need help. I'm here to, play with this for a while, go roam around in the stack, search this database, try these articles, and then let me know how it's going and I can help you. So I think that sort of, I don't want to say incrementalism, but the idea of helping people where and how they are, both inside and outside these institutional contexts, first of all, sometimes it's the best you can do, and second of all, it makes them love you and come back for more. And Samuel Green, 1876, the reason we do personal relations with people is so that they love us and support us, and I think he's as right today as he was then. So I think I'm out of time, so I will turn this back over to Laura to wrap us up.
Well, it looks like we are ready to wrap up our time together. I'd like to give a virtual round of applause to you, Joe, for sharing some really great information with all of us today. We really appreciate your time and all of your insights. As a reminder, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice that will include instructions on how to access the archive version. Thanks again to all of our participants for joining.